For months, I had been sleeping under that old bridge, my routine always the same. Looking for food during the day and finding a dark corner to rest at night. The bridge, located on the outskirts of the city, had become my refuge after I lost my job and with it, everything else. Every night, the murmur of distant traffic and the soft flow of stagnant water helped me to sleep, providing a kind of consolation in the midst of my misfortune. However, one night, everything changed. It was around 3 in the morning, the time when the silence is deepest and the darkness thickest. I woke up from a restless sleep with a feeling that something was not right. At first, I thought it was just the cold or maybe the hunger that never completely went away. But then I heard a whisper that seemed to come from the stagnant water under the bridge. I sat up slowly, my heart holding it tightly. I must be imagining things, I told myself, trying to calm down. But the whispers did not stop. On the contrary, they became clearer, more defined. It was a raspy, cultural voice, as if someone was dragging the words from the depths of their being. "Come with me," it said over and over again, more and more insistent. Fear took hold of me, paralyzing me. There was no one else under the bridge, and yet the voice was unmistakable. I looked around, looking for some rational explanation, but there was nothing and no one. Only the black and stagnant water that reflected the light of the moon in a disturbing glow. I tried to ignore the whispers, thinking it was the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. But that night, the whispers stayed with me, whispering in my ears even as I walked away from the bridge at dawn. During the day, the sounds of the city and the search for food distracted me. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice again. I decided I couldn't sleep under that bridge anymore. The thought of going back there filled me with irrational terror. But I had few options. The shelters were full, and the city streets were dangerous at night. So, with my heart in my throat, I returned to the bridge as night fell, determined to face whatever was happening. I settled in my usual corner, trying to stay awake. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional sound of a car in the distance. For a moment, I thought maybe it had all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by hunger and desperation. But then, just as my eyelids began to close, the whispers returned. This time, they didn't come from the water but seemed to surround me, echoing in the cold night air. "Come with me," they whispered, and I could feel a shiver run through me. Without thinking twice, I got up and ran as fast as my legs would carry me, away from the bridge and from that terrifying voice. I didn't stop until I was in the center of the city, surrounded by noise and lights that seemed to offer protection from the supernatural. During the following days, I tried to tell other people what had happened. Some laughed. Others looked at me with pity, but no one believed me. They told me it was just a figment of my imagination, that hunger and loneliness were affecting me. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had heard, and I felt deep down that there was something under that bridge, something dark and evil. Despite my fears, necessity drove me back to the bridge. After a few weeks, I had nowhere else to go, and the cold was beginning to be unbearable. But this time, I decided that I would not sleep. I would stay awake, alert, and find out what was going on. I took with me an old flashlight that I had found in the trash and a piece of metal that I could use as a weapon. I knew that if I wanted to face whatever was there, I would need all the help possible. I settled into my corner with the flashlight on and the piece of metal beside me. The hours passed slowly. The silence was almost absolute, and every little noise made my heart race. Then, around 3 a.m., the whispers started again. This time, I didn't try to ignore them. I got up with the flashlight in one hand and the piece of metal in the other and walked over to the water's edge. "Come with me," the voice whispered, and I could see the water moving in an unnatural way. A deep fear washed over me, but also a strange determination. I knew I had to find out what was causing those whispers. I shined the flashlight into the water, hoping to see something, anything that might explain what was happening. At first, I saw nothing, just the black, stagnant water. But then, something moved at the bottom. It was a shadow, a figure that seemed to float just below the surface. My breathing stopped. The figure began to rise, getting closer to the surface. I stepped back, feeling a growing panic, but my legs seemed to be glued to the ground. The figure emerged from the water, revealing a pale, cadaverous face with empty eyes and a mouth that moved without making a sound. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my throat. The figure came closer, extending a bony hand towards me. The cold emanated from it, making the air around me freeze. I felt as if time had stopped, as if I was trapped in a nightmare from which I could not wake up. "Come with me," the figure whispered, and in that moment, everything went black. I woke up at dawn, lying on the ground near the bridge. The piece of metal and the flashlight were scattered around me, and my entire body was shaking from cold and fear. I slowly sat up, trying to remember what had happened. The figure, the whispers, everything seemed like a bad nightmare, but the persistent fear in my chest told me that it had been real. I decided that no, I could not continue living like this. I left the bridge forever, seeking refuge in the busiest parts of the city. The experience had changed me. It had left me with a constant feeling of fear and paranoia. But the worst of all was knowing that under that bridge, something dark and evil was still waiting. Over time, I found a place in a shelter for homeless people. Although it was not a home in the strict sense, it offered a security that I had not felt in a long time. But every night when I closed my eyes, the whispers came back to my mind, reminding me that I couldn't escape what I had found under that bridge. The days turned into weeks and then months. Little by little, I tried to rebuild my life, looking for temporary jobs and trying to keep myself busy. But the feeling that something was watching me never completely went away. Every time I passed by one or heard the murmur of water, a chill ran through my body. One day, while I was walking through the city looking for work, I saw a group of people gathered near a bridge. Curiosity led me to approach and listen to what they were saying. It seemed that someone had recently disappeared, a young man who used to sleep under the same bridge where I had had my terrifying encounter. The memories flooded my mind again, and I knew that it was not a coincidence. Something under that bridge was taking people, taking them to a place from which they could not return. I tried to warn people, tell them what I had seen and heard, but once again, no one believed me. Desperate, I decided that I had to do something. I could not stay with my arms crossed. As more people disappeared, I gathered what little courage I had left and returned to the bridge, determined to face whatever was there. I took with me a more powerful flashlight, a rope, and an amulet that an old man at the shelter had given me, telling me it would protect me from evil spirits. I didn't know if I believed in such things, but at that moment, any help was welcome. I arrived at the bridge around midnight when the silence was almost palpable. The stagnant water reflected the moonlight, creating an eerie glow. I took a deep breath and approached the edge of the water with the flashlight in one hand and the amulet in the other. "Come with me," the voice whispered, and I felt a chill run down my spine. This time, I didn't back away. I shined the flashlight into the water, looking for the figure I had seen before. At first, I saw nothing, but then, just like before, a shadow began to move at the bottom. The figure emerged from the water with the same empty eyes and mouth moving silently. But this time, I wasn't alone. Other figures began to emerge around him, all with the same cadaverous appearance and lifeless eyes. I felt an overwhelming fear, but I forced myself to stay calm. "What do you want?" I screamed, hoping to get some answer. The figures stopped, their empty eyes fixed on me for a moment. Everything was silent, and then the raspy voice answered, "We want souls. Come with us." My mind was torn between terror and disbelief. My voice trembling, I said, "I won't go with you." The figures began to move again, slowly advancing towards me. I felt the air around me grow even colder, and fear turned to a feeling of desperation. I remembered the amulet I was carrying in my hand and held it in front of me, hoping it would have some effect. The figures stopped, their empty eyes seeming to focus on the amulet for a moment. I thought maybe it would work, it could scare them away, but then one of the figures spoke again. "The amulet will not save you. Come with us or you will suffer." Despair washed over me. I couldn't fight the things. I couldn't escape. I closed my eyes. Yes, the cold invaded my body, and I whispered a silent prayer, hoping for a miracle. But when I opened my eyes again, the figures were getting closer, reaching out their bony hands towards me. At that moment, I felt a strange calm. I knew there was no escape. My fate was sealed. I closed my eyes, accepting the inevitable, and waited for the end to come. But instead of feeling the cold touch of the figures, I heard a distant scream, a scream from a familiar voice. My eyes snapped open to see a man running towards me, holding a cross and shouting words in a language I didn't understand. The figures backed away, making a sound that could be described as a screech of pain. The man continued screaming and waving the cross, and the figures slowly faded away like shadows dissipating with the light. I fell to the ground, feeling relief and exhaustion overwhelm my body. The man knelt beside me, muttering words of consolation. I didn't understand how he had gotten there, but at that moment I didn't care. He had saved me, and that was all that mattered. In time, I found out the man was a priest who had heard about the disappearances and had decided to investigate. I didn't know how he had known I would be there that night, but his intervention had saved my life. He helped find a safe place in a church shelter where I attempted to rebuild my life once again. Although time has passed, the memories of that night have never left me. The whispers and cadaverous figures continue to haunt my dreams, reminding me that evil exists in dark and forgotten places. But they also remind me that even in the darkest of times, there is always a spark of hope, a chance for salvation. So, every day is a fight to keep that hope alive, to not allow fear and despair to consume me. Because although I know the bridge is still there, waiting, I also know that I am not alone in this battle. And as long as I have the strength to resist, I will not allow evil to claim me once again. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. I have always been skeptical of the paranormal. I guess we all are until we come face to face with the unexplainable. My name is Lucas, and I am a photographer. My work takes me to strange and sometimes disturbing places, but nothing prepared me for what I found in that cemetery. It was a cold autumn when I received an assignment to capture the essence of an old abandoned cemetery on the outskirts of town. The place had a gloomy reputation, with stories of apparitions and shadows that wandered among the tombstones. I thought these stories would only add a mysterious touch to my photos. Upon arrival, I came across a dirty and disheveled older man sitting on a grave. He was wearing threadbare clothes, and a stray beard covered his face. His eyes, however, were piercing and lucid. I approached cautiously, worried about his presence. I did not expect to find anyone there, much less a homeless man. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. "I watched this grave," he answered without taking his eyes off the tombstone. "Something is trying to get out of it, and I can't allow that." I didn't give his words any importance. Homeless people usually have extravagant stories, and this one didn't seem to be the exception. However, I couldn't deny that there was something in his tone that made me feel uncomfortable. Despite my reservations, I decided there was nothing to worry about. I spent the day taking photos, documenting the place. The sun began to set, casting long and sinister shadows on the ground. The tombstones looked like shadowy figures leaning towards me, as if they were trying to communicate a dark and ancient message. Around 6 p.m., the homeless man was still there, motionless, watching that same grave. Night fell, and with it, a feeling of unease took hold of me. The cold intensified, and the wind whispered through the bare branches of the trees. I decided to end my session and return to the car. While I put my equipment away, I noticed that the homeless man had gotten up and was approaching. "You must go," he said to me in a hoarse voice, desperate. "Before it is too late." "I'm on my way," I answered, trying to sound carefree. Although his warning disturbed me, I headed towards the exit of the cemetery. But something made me turn around. I saw the vagabond returning to the grave, muttering inaudible words. I thought I must be crazy, but a small spark of curiosity held me back. I decided to stay a little longer, watching him, From the distance, the full moon illuminated the cemetery, creating a surreal and terrifying landscape. The shadows moved with the wind, giving life to ghostly figures that seemed to dance among the graves. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I remained hidden behind a statue of an angel, watching the vagabond. Suddenly, a sepulchral silence fell over the place. The wind ceased, and everything was left in a tense calm. The vagabond was standing rigid, like a statue, staring at the grave. It was then that I saw him. A dark and dense shadow emerged from the ground, slowly rising like a thick fog. My heart raced, and panic took hold of me. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The shadow grew into a humanoid form but lacked any distinctive features. It seemed to absorb the moonlight, becoming a walking void. The vagabond approached the shadow, extending a trembling hand. "I will not let you take anyone else," he shouted in a voice that echoed in the stillness of the night. The shadow stopped as if it were evaluating him. Then, in a sudden movement, it lunged at him. The vagabond screamed in pain and terror, and in a blink, they both disappeared. Calm returned, but I was paralyzed by fear. I finally managed to move. I ran to my car, my thoughts disordered, and my heart beating uncontrollably. I started the engine and sped away from the cemetery without daring to look back. The following days were a mixture of disbelief and terror. I could not get what I had seen out of my head. I tried to convince myself that it had been a hallucination, a trick of my tired mind, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow and heard the vagabond scream. A few weeks later, I decided to return to the cemetery. I felt an insatiable need to understand what had happened. Perhaps I would find some rational explanation. When I arrived, I went to the grave that the wanderer had been guarding. To my surprise, there was no sign of him or the shadow. As I explored the place, I found a small cabin hidden among the trees. It seemed to be the wanderer's shelter. Inside, everything was in disarray, but something caught my eye. An old, worn notebook rested on a makeshift table. I opened it carefully, fearing it would disintegrate in my hands. The pages were filled with messy writings and scribbles, telling stories of evil spirits and ancient curses. The wanderer had been documenting his fight against the entity of the tomb for years. As I read, my disbelief faded, replaced by a terrifying realization. The last entry was especially disturbing. It described how the entity had repeatedly attempted to escape and how he had managed to contain it at the cost of his own mental health. I felt a deep respect for the man who had dedicated his life to protecting others from an evil few could understand. As I left the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. As I walked away, I couldn't help but feel that something was watching me from the shadows. I sped up, trying not to look back. Since that day, I have avoided cemeteries and any place that could have a connection to the supernatural. But the memory of that night and of the brave wanderer who fought against the darkness remains etched in my mind. His sacrifice will not be forgotten, and every time I see a shadow in the night, I remember his warning. Some things must remain buried. Although I tried to move on with my life, the experience in the cemetery left me with a lingering fear. I began to research the history of the place and discovered that it had been the scene of dark rituals and forbidden practices in the past. The legend spoke of a malevolent entity that had been sealed in a tomb by ancient sorcerers, a force so dark that its mere existence could corrupt the living. These stories only confirmed what I already feared. The wanderer had been telling the truth. His fight had not been in vain, and now I understood the magnitude of the danger he had faced. As I delved deeper into the research, I found references to other guardians who had protected similar tombs around the world. They were lonely and forgotten individuals whose sacrifices went unnoticed by most people. Over time, my curiosity turned into a mission. I felt a responsibility, a calling to continue the work of the vagabond. I could not allow the entity to escape again. I returned to the cemetery with new equipment, determined to protect the grave and document any paranormal activity. For weeks, I watched the place, facing constant fear. The nights were the worst. The shadows seemed to come to life, and the whispers of the wind brought with them promises of torment and desolation. I knew the entity was there, lurking, waiting for a moment of weakness to break free. One night, while reviewing my recordings, I heard a clear and crisp whisper. It was the voice of the vagabond, warning me not to let my guard down. His words gave me the strength to continue. The fight was exhausting, both physically and mentally, but I could not give up. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. My life seemed like a distant memory. Each sunrise was a victory, and each sunset a reminder of the ongoing battle. I began to notice the entity becoming more active. Its attempts to escape were more frequent and aggressive. One night, the situation reached a critical point. The shadows emerged from the grave with an intensity one had never seen before. The temperature dropped drastically, and the air filled with a crushing pressure. I felt my time was running out. With one last effort, I called upon the words I had found in the Wanderer's notebook, an ancient invocation meant to seal the entity. The process was painful and heartbreaking. The shadows resisted, but finally, with a deafening scream, they vanished into the darkness. The cemetery returned to its eerie stillness. I knew the entity had been contained once again, but I could not stay. My mind and body were on the verge of collapse. By dawn, I left the cemetery, knowing another guardian would be called eventually. My life was never the same. The paranormal experiences left an indelible mark on my soul. I am not a hero. I am just someone who was lucky enough to survive the unexplainable. Now, every time I pass a cemetery, I can't help but remember the brave vagabond and his sacrifice. His fight was a reminder that sometimes the darkest shadows hide in the most unexpected places, and even if we try to forget them, they will always be there, waiting patiently to be released. In the city, with its endless bustle and lights that never go out, I lived a monotonous and emotionless life. I worked at a bank, a job that provided me with a decent salary but drained any spark of adventure or interest I once had. Each night, I walked home following the same route, the same routine, secretly wishing that something, anything, would break the monotony. One night, after a particularly long day, I decided to take a different route, a shorter but less traveled and somewhat darker path. As I walked along, I came across a man who seemed lost in thought. His disheveled appearance and vacant look indicated he was a vagabond. He asked me for a cigarette. Though he didn't smoke, I always carried a pack for those stressful moments at work. I offered him one, and he thanked me with an almost imperceptible gesture. The homeless man lit the cigarette and, after a long drag, began to speak. His voice was a raspy whisper, as if he had spent years without talking to anyone. "I have seen my own death," he said, and his words sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to ignore it, assuming he was delirious, but the intensity in his eyes made me doubt. He told me a chilling story. One night, while looking for a place to sleep, he had come across an alley he had never seen before. Something in that alley was attracting him, an invisible and irresistible force. As he entered, the world around him changed. The shadows lengthened and began to move as if they had a life of their own. From among the shadows, a figure emerged, a version of himself, but older, emaciated, and with an expression of absolute terror. His other version showed him visions of his death. He saw his body lying on a deserted street with the same expression of horror that his double showed. I watched, then, as if I were a spectator of my own fate. I saw how the passers-by passed by, indifferent to his corpse. The vagrant finished his story with a barely audible whisper. It was as if he were trapped in a mirror, forced to see his own death over and over again. I tried not to give importance to his story, assuming it was the result of a mind disturbed by loneliness and hunger. But something in his gaze, something in the way his hands trembled while he smoked, made me think about it for days. A few days later, when I returned from work, I decided to pass by the same place where I had found the vagrant. To my horror, I found him dead, exactly in the same place where he had told me his story. His face was frozen in an expression of indescribable terror, as if he had seen something his mind could not understand. I called the police, and while we waited for them to arrive, I could not help but notice that his hands were still holding the cigarette I had given him. The police treated it as just another death of a homeless person, but I knew there was something else, something dark and supernatural. The following nights were hell. I could not sleep, tormented by nightmares in which I saw the vagabond over and over again, his face frozen in terror. Inaudible whispers filled my mind every time I closed my eyes. I saw his death as if his fate was now tied to mine. I tried to avoid the place, but something pushed me to return, an invisible and irresistible force similar to the one the vagabond had described. One night, unable to resist any longer, I returned to the alley. What I saw froze my blood. The shadows moved again, lengthening and twisting. From among them, a figure emerged, my figure. It was like looking at myself in a distorted mirror. My other self showed me visions of my own death in the same alley, with the same expression of terror that I had seen in the vagabond. Desperation invaded me. I tried to run, but my legs would not respond. I was trapped, forced to see my own destiny. The shadows enveloped me, and I knew that my end was near. I felt an intense cold, and my vision became blurred. The last thing I saw was my own face, frozen in terror, before everything turned to darkness. I woke up in my bed, sweating and with my heart beating hard. I looked around, trying to convince myself that it had all been a nightmare. But when I saw the cigarette on my nightstand, I knew there was no escape. The hobo's curse was now mine, and every night the shadows came to remind me of it. Time passed, and my mental health deteriorated. I was no longer able to distinguish between reality and nightmares. Every night, the shadows became more intense, more real. I tried to seek help, but no one believed me. I became a parasite, living in constant fear that my end was near. One day, as I was walking aimlessly, I found another hobo. He seemed lost in thought just like the first one. He asked me for a cigarette, and as I gave it to him, he looked at me with an intensity one instantly recognized. "I have seen my own death," he said, and I knew the curse was not going to end with me. It was destined to continue, trapping more souls in its eternal cycle of terror. Eventually, I stopped fighting. I accepted my destiny, knowing my death was written and there was no escape. The shadows became my constant companions, whispering my name in the dark. One night, in the same alley, I finally came face to face with my own end. "The cycle is," he repeated, and my face froze in an expression of absolute terror, a silent warning to anyone who dared to cross the threshold of the unknown. Now, I am part of the shadows, waiting for the next unfortunate person to fall into our trap. Life on the street is not easy. One gets used to sleeping in unexpected places, avoiding problems, and looking for temporary shelters. Since I lost my job and then my home, I had learned to survive in the urban jungle. My days passed in a desperate monotony, and the nights brought with them the true challenge, finding a safe place to sleep. I had discovered the old abandoned factory a few weeks ago, located on the outskirts of the city. The dilapidated building was a perfect refuge, or at least that's what I thought at first. The broken windows and graffitied walls gave it an air of desolation, but the structure was still solid, and most importantly, it was empty. There were no competitors for space, no addicts or gang members. It was a quiet place. The first few nights passed without incident, and I was grateful to have a roof over my head. I had chosen a corner on the second floor where the structure was still stable, and where I could easily keep an eye on the entrances. There was enough scrap and debris to build a makeshift bed of sorts, and although the rats were a nuisance, they were something I could deal with. But then the noises started. The first time I heard them, I thought it was my imagination. The sound of light footsteps as if someone was walking through the dark hallways. I peeked out several times but saw no one. I thought maybe it was animals or the wind moving some loose structure. However, the noises continued night after night. Footsteps, whispering, the sound of something dragging. Sometimes they seemed to come from very close, other times from the lower levels of the factory. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I saw a shadow move at the edge of my vision. I sat up quickly, my senses alert, but saw nothing concrete. The shadow moved in the corners as if it were watching me. Despite my fear, I forced myself to think it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Things got really scary a week later. It was a cold night, and the full moon cast a dim light through the broken windows. The noises were louder that night, and I felt a growing sense of unease as I tried to fall asleep. I heard something different, a low guttural chant echoing from the lower levels of the factory. I couldn't contain my curiosity and, against my better judgment, decided to investigate. I walked down the rusty stairs, each step echoing in the silence of the night. The chanting grew louder as I approached the first floor. The darkness was thick, and I used my lighter to light the way, but the small flame only seemed to make the shadows move more eerily. I finally came to a door that led to the basement. The chanting was clearly audible now, a litany in a language I couldn't understand. I opened the door slowly, the creaking of the hinges echoing in the void. I walked down the cement stairs, feeling the air grow thicker, denser with each step. As I reached the bottom, I found myself with a sight that froze my blood. In the center of the room was a group of people dressed in black robes, forming a circle around a symbol painted on the floor with what appeared to be blood. There were lit candles in the corners of the room, and the air was permeated with the acrid smell of incense. My heart was pounding as I watched in silence, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The cult members continued their chant, their voices echoing in the darkness. I noticed there was something inside the circle, something that moved. It was a bound and gagged human figure, writhing weakly. Horror washed over me as I realized I had witnessed a dark ritual, something I should never have seen. I slowly backed away, hoping to escape without being discovered. But my hopes were dashed when my foot tripped on some rubble, making a noise that echoed through the basement like thunder. The voices immediately ceased, and the hooded heads turned towards me in unison. For a moment, everything was silent, and then one of them raised his hand and pointed in my direction. I tried to run, but my feet felt heavy as if they were trapped in mud. I felt cold. Strong hands grabbed me, dragging me towards the circle. I was thrown to the ground, and the figure tied in the center of the circle looked at me with eyes full of despair and terror. The members of the sect began to recite again, this time louder and with more fervor. I felt something evil hovering over us, a presence that was tangible in the darkness. I tried to resist, screaming, but my strength abandoned me. They pinned me to the ground, and one of them, the leader, I suppose, approached with a ceremonial knife. The edge shone in the candlelight, and I could see my reflection in it. My eyes were full of bread. The chant intensified, and I felt as if the factory itself was resonating with the dark energy of their ritual. With a quick movement, the knife sank into my arm, and a cry of pain escaped my lips. Blood gushed out, and the leader collected it in a container. They continued to chant, and I felt my consciousness fading away, dragged by the pain and terror. I woke up in the darkness. I didn't know how much time had passed. My injured arm was wrapped in dirty bandages, and my body ached all over. I was alone, or so I thought at first. The factory was silent, but not the usual silence. It was one filled with an oppressive feeling of threat. I tried to get up, but my legs were shaking. I had to get out of there. I had to find help. I walked, staggering, the shadows seeming to move around me as if they were alive. When I got to the exit, I found the main door closed with thick chains. Desperation invaded me, and I hit the door with my hands, screaming for help, but no one answered. I was trapped. I decided to look for another way out. As I walked through the halls, I heard whispers, voices that seemed to come from all directions. I saw shadows move out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned my head, there was nothing there. The factory had stopped being a refuge. It had become a prison. Finally, I found a broken window through which I could get out. I climbed through the rubble and slid outside. The cool air hit my face, but it was no relief. I knew I wasn't safe. I ran as fast as I could, without looking back. I felt something chasing me, something I couldn't see, but I knew it was there. I didn't stop until I came to a busy road, where I collapsed and injured. A motorist stopped and called the police. They took me to the hospital where I was treated for my injuries. I tried to explain what I had seen, but no one believed me. They took me for a madman, just another homeless man with delusions. But I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. And every night, when I close my eyes, I see those shadows. I hear those chants, and I feel the presence of something dark and evil that will never leave me alone. The abandoned factory is still there, and with it, the horrors I witnessed. No one knows the truth, and I fear that one day, someone else will find that place and face the darkness that lives within it. In the quiet mountain town where I live, the vagabonds have always been a familiar presence on the streets. But lately, something has changed. They are no longer the same dirty, disheveled individuals who used to beg on street corners. There is something disturbing now about their empty stares and the way they wander around as if an invisible shadow is guarding them. I noticed the change one night as I was returning home after work. It was late, and the cold mountain air bit my skin. The streetlights cast long shadows, twisted on the walls of the buildings. It was then that I saw one of them, a man who used to sit on the corner of the main square, now wandering aimlessly, muttering to himself in a low, guttural tone. At first, I thought it was just an isolated case. However, as the days went by, more and more vagrants began to show the same erratic behavior. Their eyes, once filled with despair and sadness, now seemed empty, as if they had lost their humanity. One night, while I was walking my dog, I saw a group of them gathered around a bonfire in the park. Their faces, illuminated by the flames, showed an expression of disturbing serenity. I hid behind a tree, watching with curiosity and fear. They were performing some kind of ritual, their movements slow and deliberate, and their murmurs synchronized in a hypnotic chant. I couldn't look away. I felt a mixture of fascination and repulsion. Suddenly, one of them looked up, and our eyes met. His empty, dark eyes seemed to penetrate my soul. I turned around and hurried out of the park with my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of those empty eyes and the sound of the chanting echoed in my mind. The next day, I tried to talk to some neighbors about what I had seen, but no one took me seriously. I decided to investigate on my own. Something inside me told me there was something more at play. I began to follow the homeless people, observing their movements and trying to understand their behavior. What I discovered was terrifying. They always met in specific places, old abandoned buildings and deserted areas of the forest. Their rituals seemed to follow a pattern, and their chants were increasingly intense. One night, I decided to get closer. I plucked up my courage and went into the forest where they used to meet, hidden behind some bushes. I watched how they gathered around a stone carved with strange symbols. Their chants echoed in the air, and I felt a strange energy that seemed to pulse from the ground. Suddenly, one of them collapsed on the ground, shaking and convulsing. The others continued singing without showing any concern for their companion. What I saw next left me frozen. A dark shadow rose from the man's body, taking a humanoid form before disappearing into the air. I felt my legs turn to jelly, and I could barely contain a scream. I knew I had to get out of there before they discovered me. I ran back to my house without stopping until I was sure I was safe. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. I was convinced that the vagabonds were being controlled by some dark force. I decided to investigate the symbols I had seen on the stone. I spent hours in the village library, searching through old books and documents. I finally found something that took my breath away. The symbols belonged to an ancient cult that had been expelled from the village centuries ago. It was said that they practiced dark rituals, and that they had made a pact with evil entities to obtain power and riches. The story told that the villagers had managed to expel the cult, but not without paying a high price. Many had disappeared, and the few who survived refused to talk about what happened. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those words. It was clear the cult had returned, and they were using the vagabonds to perform their rituals. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. I decided to confront the vagabonds. Although the idea terrified me, one night I gathered my courage and returned to the forest. This time I didn't hide. I walked towards them, trying to appear confident. The chants stopped abruptly, and all eyes turned to me. I felt my heart stop, but I couldn't turn back. "I know what you're doing," I said in a firm voice. "I know about the cult, and the rituals have to stop." The vagabonds looked at me in silence, and for a moment, I thought I had made a grave mistake. But then one of them stepped forward. "We can't stop," he said in a tone that seemed to come from another world. "The pact must be fulfilled." Before I could react, I felt an invisible force pushing me back. I fell to the ground and saw how the vagabonds approached, their empty and dark eyes shining with a malevolent light. I tried to get up, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, and I felt my energy fading. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was the dark shadow rising again, and a feeling of absolute despair took over me. I woke up in my bed, covered in cold sweat. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, but the marks on my body told me otherwise. I knew it had been a warning, and that I was in danger. The following days were hell. I felt like someone was constantly watching me, and my nights were plagued with nightmares. The vagabonds continued with their rituals, and no one in the town seemed to notice what was happening. I decided to leave the town, packing in the hopes of leaving the nightmare behind. But as I waited, I saw one of the vagabonds approaching. His gaze was intense, and I felt a chill. "You can't escape," he said in a voice that echoed in my mind. "The pact has claimed you." Before I could react, I felt a dark force take over me. Everything went black, and I knew my fate was sealed. I woke up in an unknown place, surrounded by shadows and whispers. I felt like my body no longer belonged to me, and a feeling of absolute despair took over me. I knew I was trapped in an endless cycle of horror, and that I would never find peace. The vagabonds of the town had fulfilled their pact, and I was just another victim of their darkness. Time lost its meaning as I wandered through that place, trapped between reality and the afterlife. There was no escape, and every day was a reminder of my sealed fate. The vagabonds continued with their rituals, and I became part of their dark history, a soul lost in the shadows of their pact. Every night, in my moments of lucidity, I remembered my life before all this, the quiet town and the people I loved. But those memories were quickly fading, replaced by the darkness that surrounded me. The whispers turned to screams, and I felt my mind slowly fragmenting. I knew I would never find peace, and that my soul was doomed to wander eternally in the shadows. My story became a warning to those who dared to investigate too much about the mysteries dark ones of the town. Some listened, some didn't, but the darkness was always there, waiting to claim its next victim. Reality had faded away from me, and my existence became an endless cycle of horror and despair.